Hello, everyone. Today we are covering the new Jim Crow, chapters 4 and 5. So this will be a very intense lecture. Chapter 4 is entitled The Cruel Hand. And let's understand, first of all, what this means. This image is an image that Alexander is taking from Frederick Douglass. And here we have the image of someone with a snarly, strong hand oppressing, keeping down, torturing someone else. So, unlike a helping hand, this is a cruel hand. And I'm going to read a bit from page 140. Here she cites Frederick Douglass. A heavy and cruel hand has been laid upon us. As a people, we feel ourselves to be not only deeply injured, but grossly misunderstood. Our white countrymen do not know us. They are strangers to our character, ignorant of our capacity, oblivious to our history and progress, and are misinformed as to the principles and ideas that control and guide us as a people. And I will pause there to explain, how does this relate to mass incarceration? Michelle Alexander is claiming that not only does mass incarceration lead to a cruel hand, but the after effects of mass incarceration are a cruel and torturous hand that is placed upon people of color, specifically African Americans and Latinos. On page 141, she explains that society tells us that we have permission to hate criminals, right? And notice here, criminals, she had made an argument in a previous chapter, is actually just code word for people of color, right? So here we have been told by the media, right? We have been conditioned by the newscasts, by the movies, that it is okay for us to hate criminals. So when we hear, we see the image of a black person who's a criminal, or a Latino person who is a criminal, most people, because they don't understand the reality of mass incarceration, the system of mass incarceration, they think to themselves, it's okay to hate those people. They deserve it. They deserve not only to have paid for their crime, but the lifelong sentence and stigma that is attached to being a felon here in the United States. On page 147, she begins to list all of the terrible things that felons must deal with upon their release. One strike equals no home for many ex-felons. This is because of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988. And that act had stringent, very strict policies against using public housing to house ex-felons, especially those convicted of drug crimes. Now, note here, many African Americans depend on public housing for their homes, right? And so if they have been convicted of a drug crime and then they get released from prison, even if they were not dealing drugs, even if they were simply possessing drugs, which is the majority of people who were swept into mass incarceration, they will have no home to go back to. And if their mother or their grandmother attempts to house them, they can all be kicked out on the streets. And of course, we know that then this leads to the ex-felon being unstable, the ex-felon being homeless. On page 150, she describes how 70% of ex-felons are high school dropouts. So we are dealing with a population that is basically illiterate. And these illiterate ex-felons have a mountain to overcome to integrate back into society. For example, felons are denied professional licenses. So this means that if they are felons, they are automatically barred from becoming barbers, because you need a professional license to be a barber. They're denied to becoming teachers. They will never be allowed to be teachers because they're denied professional licenses, right? They're denied to become insurance agents because that is a professional license. So, of course, we see by this example that they are very confined to what they can do once they are released from prison. Page 154 deals with the extremely controversial black box, which is known as the employment application checkbox. Many of you know that many potential employers ask applicants to check if they've ever been convicted of a crime. And of course, ex-felons must check yes in that employment application. And we know that what that means is that most likely they will not be able to be employed. That a job employer will read that check and they will throw that application in the garbage. Now, let's briefly understand what is the rationale behind the black box, okay? I can imagine that employers think, well, I can't hire this person because this person is dangerous. They will attack their fellow employees. They will rape their fellow employees. They will rob and steal and deal drugs at work. I can't have this. I can't have this, right? Now, that rationale, let's understand, probably would not have applied to most people who had been released from prison during the mass incarceration era. Why? Because those people, most of them had been arrested for simple possession of marijuana. And most employers might not think that, wow, I need to be really careful of stoner stoner, and that's a stereotype as well, right? But I'm trying to make an example that the rationale falls apart once we look at what was actually occurring during the mass incarceration era. Page 155, Michelle Alexander discusses how ex-felons have to deal with the mountain of fees, right? And let's understand some of these fees that ex-felons have to pay. Probation fees, parole fees, victims fees, restitution fees, child support, etc., right? And in many states, if those ex-felons do not pay those fees, they are sent to debtors' prisons. So think of the absurdity in this situation. Here we have people who have paid for their crimes. They have paid for their crimes because they have done the time. And now they are being told that they have to pay all of these fees, which can be hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. And think of the absurdity of what it would require for those ex-felons to pay those fees. First of all, they would have to get a job. And if they are, notice, they're most likely not going to be able to get a job, yet those fees do not go away. So they get released, they don't have a home, or it's very hard for them to get a home, right? Most of them are functionally illiterate. They're denied any promising potential because they can't get professional licenses. They can't get a job, and then they have all of these fees. Page 156, Michelle Alexander explains, it is very easy if a person is in that situation to resort to the only way they can make money, which would be an illegal economy. They are even denied driver's licenses because of child support that they may have had to pay once they were in prison, because they were in prison. Page 160, Michelle Alexander also summarizes for us that in many states, felons and ex-felons are not allowed to vote. And she gives the example of Florida, that if during the 2000 election, presidential election between Bush versus Gore, that if felons and ex-felons had been allowed to vote, that most likely the United States would have had Al Gore as president of the United States. That is assuming, of course, that most, and this is according to data, most African Americans vote Democratic. So this cruel hand keeps African Americans out of power. So they do not have a voice in politics because of the mass incarceration caste system. Page 162, all of these terrible tortures lead to to ex-felons feeling like pariahs. They suffer from a mental punishment for the rest of their lives. I am going to read from page 162. Practically, from cradle to grave, black males in urban ghettos are treated like current or future criminals. Page 165, Michelle Alexander explains that felons feel isolated. They gain a distrust of others. They gain a distrust of the system because it has treated them so cruelly. So with all of this, really horrible, cruel hand placed upon them, not only during the time that they paid for their crime, but for the rest of their lives, many felons of color end up embracing the stigma of what it means to be a criminal, right? Michelle Alexander explains this on page 171 in a section that she entitles Gangsta Love. And Gangsta Love has to do with felons of color embracing criminality, getting tattoos all over their faces and their necks, and putting on the tough guy persona because they feel psychologically, well, society doesn't care about me. Society tortures me. Everyone hates me. The only ones that love me are my fellow gangsters. On page 174, Michelle Alexander explains the Minstrel Show. Now, I'm briefly going to talk about this. The Minstrel Show, if you did not know, was the most popular form of entertainment in the United States 19th century and early 20th century. What did this have to do with? This had to do with blackface. Read about this on your own. African Americans were made, if they were acting, if they were entertaining, they were made to put blackface on their face. And whites who wanted to act like African American stereotypes, they would paint their faces black and then put on an entertainment show. This was the most popular form of entertainment in the United States. Now, Michelle Alexander is claiming here in this section that after all of this cruelty, some African Americans have learned how to use the minstrel show to gain success. So, what she's saying here is that society confines many people of color to criminality. So they embrace their criminality, or they embrace the stereotype of criminality and put on a minstrel show for the success, for their own success. Some people of color are actually able to gain power through this method. Think of, for example, popular rappers. Okay? Now, we are going to move into the next chapter. And the next chapter is entitled The New Jim Crow, Chapter 5. This chapter is a summary of the book up to this point. A very interesting chapter where Michelle Alexander addresses arguments against the logos that is embedded in the book. So here she provides counter arguments and then rebuts those counter arguments. On page 179, she begins the chapter by giving us a scene where President Barack Obama critiques black fathers, right? And this is a popular ploy that many have done. For example, Bill Cosby and other black popular figures, such as President Barack Obama, have used what Michelle Alexander calls is the shaming strategy, right? So they critique black fathers and they blame black fathers for not being fathers to their children, right? And the argument goes that this is the reason for the deterioration of the black community. Michelle Alexander, however, asked the question, where are these black fathers? Where are all the men? And of course, because of our study, now we know that many of these men are in prison. So they're not there because they don't want to be there. They're not there because they don't want to raise their children. They're gone because they are in another world, the prison world. Page 183, Michelle Alexander confronts the popular notion that criminals deserve what they get, right? And let's understand this rationale, right? That, okay, well, it's your fault, criminal. If you smoked marijuana, if you smoked crack, if you dealt drugs, then you deserve to be punished. But Michelle Alexander says that most people do not understand how the system actually works in an extremely racist manner, right? I'm going to read now from page 185. Page 185, this may be one of the most important pages in the entire book for summary purposes, in order for you to understand what the book is actually all about. Here, in one succinct paragraph, she summarizes what she has covered up to this point in the entire book. I will read. This is from a section on page 185 called How It Works. Precisely this in brief is how the system works. The war on drugs is the vehicle through which extraordinary numbers of black men are forced into the cage. The entrapment occurs in 3 distinct phases, each of which has been explored earlier, but a brief review is useful here. The first stage is the roundup. Vast numbers of people are swept into the criminal justice system by the police, who conduct drug operations primarily in poor communities of color. They are rewarded cash through drug forfeiture laws and federal grant programs for rounding up as many people as possible, and they operate unconstrained by constitutional rules of procedure that once were considered inviolate. Police can stop, interrogate, and search anyone they choose for drug investigations, provided they get consent, because there is no meaningful check on the exercise of police discretion, racial biases are granted free rein. In fact, police are allowed to rely on race as a factor in selecting whom to stop and search, effectively guaranteeing that those who are swept in the system are primarily black and brown. I can go on, but you can read more about that on pages 185 and 186. I'm going to move now to page 188 and read from Michelle Alexander. Here she states, in ghetto communities, nearly everyone is either directly or indirectly subject to the new caste system. And let's explore this a bit further. Note here, so in ghetto communities, in the barrios, in the hoods, right? Everyone is somehow connected to this. You had, during the mass incarceration, mostly the males of color being imprisoned, right? Nowadays, women, however, are also becoming a big part of the imprisoned people in the United States, okay? But in the past, it was mostly the males. Now, note what that does to a community. That, of course, affects everyone in that community, because now the mother must become both. The mother who is left behind must become both mother and father, right? That affects the child, because the child is going to grow up without the father in the household. That affects education, the educational system. That affects the concept of family. So in these communities, everyone is either directly or indirectly affected by the new caste system. The myth of choice that the people can choose to get out of this, that myth is seductive, but it is wrong. I am going to read from page 197 now. Michelle Alexander states on page 197, the temptation is to insist that black men choose to be criminals. The system does not make them criminals, at least not in the way that slavery made black slaves or Jim Crow made them second-class citizens. The myth of choice here is seductive, but it should be resisted. African Americans are not significantly more likely to use or sell prohibited drugs than whites, but they are made criminals at drastically higher rates for precisely the same conduct. In fact, studies suggest that white professionals may be the most likely of any group to have engaged in illegal drug activity in their lifetime, yet they are the least likely to be made criminals. Page 201. Michelle Alexander explains that a facially race-neutral system of laws has operated to create a racial caste system here in the United States. I am going to read a brief piece here. Laws prohibiting the use and sale of drugs are facially race neutral, but they are enforced in a highly discriminatory fashion. Okay, so I'm going to pause right there to explain this. So let's understand that the law does not state that it is going to punish black people more severely than white people. There is nothing that states this, right? This is a facially race-neutral system, but it has operated to create a racial caste system here in the United States. And it has done this under the guise of colorblindness. Now, one of the more controversial counter arguments she confronts is on page 205. I'm going to summarize this, okay, and perhaps read a little bit as well. Many might argue, hey, Michelle Alexander, you got it wrong. You don't understand. Look, many whites have been arrested and many whites are imprisoned in the war on drugs. Michelle Alexander, she rebuts this by stating, whites are collateral damage in the war on drugs. This is a very controversial opinion, but I am going to read exactly what she says from page 105. Of course, the fact that white people are harmed by the drug war does not mean they are the real targets, the designated enemy. The harm white people suffer in the drug war is much like the harm Iraqi civilians suffer in U.S. military actions targeting presumed terrorists or insurgents. In any war, a tremendous amount of collateral damage is inevitable. Black and brown people are the principal targets in this war. White people are collateral damage. On page 206, Michelle Alexander provides an analogy that is a very powerful analogy one should meditate on to understand and question, why do we even have a war on drugs? Drunk driving is a much worse crime than smoking crack, okay, or smoking marijuana. But I'm going to use the smoking crack example here because many people think of that as evil and very harmful. But in fact, let's understand, smoking crack, and I'm not condoning smoking crack. I'm not promoting the smoking of crack right now, but I'm just using this as an example. Libertarians, I think, could safely argue that smoking crack does not have a harmful effect except on those who smoke it, right? Okay, and let's understand, there were a lot of scare tactics during the crack era, but crack does not usually lead to death. Smoking marijuana has never led to overdose death. Yet crack and marijuana are regarded as evil and dangerous. But in fact, and this is a fact, drunk driving is much more dangerous, deadly, and harmful to society than smoking crack or marijuana. Yet, drunk driving does not lead to lengthy prison sentences, okay? You know, perhaps, that most drunk driving convictions are misdemeanor convictions that do not lead to any serious jail time. Okay? And Michelle Alexander brings this up because this should show that drunk driving should be, if we're looking at drugs as evil and harmful, drunk driving should be just as severe a penalty. But she claims that it is not, because drunk driving, people who are stopped for drunk driving are overwhelmingly white. They are not, police officers, highway patrol officers stop people because they're swerving. They stop people and bust them because they have alcohol. They can't walk a straight line. And most people who end up getting busted for drunk driving are white. In the war on drugs, if we use that same analogy, most people who should have been convicted in the war on drugs should have been white. This is not a racist statement. This is using simply demographic statistics. The majority of the population in the United States are white, quote unquote white. And so therefore, if we truly had a colorblind system, most people in prison for drugs should have been white. Now, pages 216 to the end of the chapter, Michelle Alexander counter argues against a lot of points, okay? And I'm going to summarize some of the more drastic ones. She says that idealism is not a liberation strategy. To try to tell somebody, hey, poor young African American or Latino, don't do drugs, be a nice, good person. That does not work to liberate people out of this cruel hand system. The solution to shame criminals does not work. The reality is that the black economy has collapsed, and African Americans are mostly irrelevant to the new economy. The solution has been to make them relevant to the new economy by imprisoning them. If you imprison African Americans and Latinos in prisons, they can make the system money. Let's understand that in California, it costs $81,000 per year to keep a person in prison for 1 year. So nowadays, that means that the system does not need poor African Americans or Latinos to pick cotton or lettuce. All they need is for these people of color to sit in their jail cells, in their prison pods, and play dominoes and spades, and they work as the new economy that makes $81,000 a year off of that poor brown and black body. This is the reality of the cruel hand. Goodbye.